Eleanor Thompson sat in the quiet of her modest, one-bedroom apartment, gazing at the framed photograph of her late husband, Frank, resting on the mantel. The apartment was located in a small town she barely knew, far away from where she had built her life and raised her children, Michael and Sarah. Now in her 70s, Eleanor had expected to spend her later years surrounded by family, with the comfort of familiar faces and the warmth of shared memories. However, life had taken a turn she hadn't foreseen. Frank's passing had shattered her world, leaving an emptiness that no one seemed willing to fill. When Frank had died, Eleanor's children initially supported her, but the demands of their own lives quickly took priority. Michael, a busy lawyer in Chicago, and Sarah, a mother of two in Seattle, had their own families and careers to focus on. Over time, their visits grew infrequent and calls became scarce. Eleanor tried not to feel hurt, telling herself they were simply busy. But after a few months, her children sat her down and explained their decision to move her to a town far away, where they believed she could make new friends and adjust to her new life. The truth was more painful. They felt she was a burden. The words echoed painfully in her mind, though they hadn't said it outright. One afternoon, Eleanor sat with her daughter Sarah before the move. "Mom, it's just that you're alone now," Sarah said, avoiding her gaze. "It's not easy for us to come over every weekend, and this place, well, it's too big for one person." Eleanor swallowed, nodding slowly, hiding the ache in her chest. "I understand, dear. I don't want to be in the way." Michael, seated across the room, adjusted his tie, his tone brisk. "It's for the best, Mom. This town we found, it's smaller, quieter. You'll be fine there." "Fine," Eleanor murmured, though the word felt hollow. So here she was, alone in an unfamiliar town, left to piece together a life from what was left of her shattered heart. The days were long, each hour stretching painfully without Frank's presence. The loneliness gnawed at her, an unyielding ache that neither time nor distraction could soothe. She spent days sitting by her window, watching the world outside, people bustling by with purpose, a purpose she no longer felt. Yet, amid her grief, a small ember of resilience remained. As she looked around the empty apartment, Eleanor resolved that she wouldn't fade away here, abandoned and forgotten. She would find a way to survive. Eleanor's decision to seek independence felt bold, even reckless, for a woman of her age. She couldn't bear the thought of living out her days in isolation, merely waiting for her children to visit, which might never happen. One morning, she took a long walk down the dusty roads surrounding the town and found herself staring at the sprawling expanse of a nearby cattle ranch. Its wide fields and grazing cattle seemed both daunting and strangely inviting. She noticed a help-wanted sign posted at the ranch gate. Taking a deep breath, she approached the main office, her heart pounding with both anxiety and an unusual spark of determination. Inside, Eleanor met Mr. Howard, the ranch owner, a rugged man in his early 60s with graying hair and a kind, thoughtful gaze. He looked surprised to see a woman of her age applying for the job. "Are you sure about this, ma'am?" he asked gently. "The work is tough here. Ranch life can be hard on folks, especially for those who aren't used to it." Eleanor straightened her back, meeting his gaze firmly. "Mr. Howard, I may be old, but I can work hard. I need something to keep me going, something that makes me feel alive. I'm not asking for any special treatment, just a chance to prove myself." Her conviction impressed Mr. Howard, and after a pause, he nodded. "All right, Eleanor. We could use the extra help, especially during the busy season. I'll start you off with lighter tasks, but don't hesitate to let me know if it's too much." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, a weight lifting from her shoulders. She felt a glimmer of purpose return as she accepted the job. The next day, Eleanor arrived at the ranch early, wearing an old pair of jeans and a borrowed plaid shirt. She was assigned to feed the chickens and assist in the barn. Though the tasks were physically demanding, Eleanor moved with a quiet determination, even as her back and joints ached with each movement. The fresh air filled her lungs, and the rhythmic tasks brought a sense of calm that she hadn't felt in months. Her hands, though worn and fragile, found strength she hadn't known she still possessed. Later that day, As Eleanor hauled a sack of feed across the barn, she paused, struggling to catch her breath. A young worker passing by glanced at her with curiosity and mild amusement. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, though she was visibly exhausted. "Just catching my breath. It's been a while since I've done this kind of work." The young man chuckled. "Well, you're doing better than some of the younger ones I've seen start here. Keep it up." Those words were small, but they planted something in Eleanor, a sense of worth, of being seen. Despite the physical strain, Eleanor felt her spirit lift as she continued working. Each day at the ranch gave her more than a paycheck. It was a balm for her loneliness, a way to prove to herself that she still had something to give. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor grew familiar with the rhythm of the ranch. Each morning, she rose before dawn, her body aching but her resolve intact. It wasn't long before she met Emily, a young woman in her mid-20s who had worked at the ranch for years. Emily was small and wiry, with a constant spark of energy and kindness that lit up her brown eyes. She wore her hair in a loose braid under a weathered baseball cap and had a knack for handling both animals and people with gentle ease. Eleanor noticed Emily's warm smile one morning as she passed by, hauling bales of hay with an effortless strength Eleanor admired. One afternoon, as Eleanor struggled with a particularly heavy bundle, Emily walked over, her hands on her hips, grinning. "Need a hand there?" she asked, her voice light with a hint of mischief. Eleanor huffed, her face flushed. "I think I can manage, but I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't appreciate a little help." Emily laughed and effortlessly took the load, setting it down with ease. "You know, Eleanor, most people wouldn't even try what you're doing here. I've seen guys half your age give up after a week." Eleanor let out a breath and smiled. "Well, I'm not one to quit. I've got to keep going. This place, it's given me something I didn't realize I needed." Emily's expression softened. She sensed there was more behind Eleanor's words, a quiet pain and resilience. "I get that," she said, her tone gentle. "When I first came here, I felt a bit lost myself. This ranch can feel like a sanctuary, especially when life doesn't make sense." Over the following days, a friendship blossomed between the two women. Emily showed Eleanor the tricks of the trade, like how to pace herself to avoid straining her body and ways to handle the animals safely. They shared laughter, quiet talks, and even a few secrets as they worked side by side. Emily, seeing the struggles Eleanor faced, admired her spirit and strength. One evening, as they rested after a long day, Emily looked over at Eleanor, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "Can I ask you something, Eleanor?" "Of course," Eleanor replied, wiping her brow. "Why are you here? I mean, it's rare to see someone, well, your age working here. There's got to be a story behind it." Eleanor hesitated, her eyes drifting to the fading light over the ranch fields. She hadn't spoken of her family to anyone here, and the thought brought a sting of sadness. "Let's just say I've had to start over," she said softly. "My kids, they thought I'd be better off somewhere else. So, here I am, making do on my own." Emily reached over, placing a comforting hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Well, you're not on your own here. You've got me, and a whole ranch of people who've got your back." Eleanor smiled, her heart warming at Emily's words. She hadn't realized how much she needed a friend. Emily's support reminded her that, despite the loneliness and hardship, there were still people who valued her, who saw her as more than a burden. The ranch had become more than just a place to work. It was starting to feel like a new home, and Emily was a friend she hadn't known she was missing. As Eleanor settled into her routine at the ranch, not everyone welcomed her presence. Mike, the foreman, was a man in his late 40s with a rough, intimidating demeanor. He had a thick build and a permanent scowl etched into his face, a man whose voice alone could make anyone feel 2 feet tall. Mike ran the ranch with an iron fist, valuing efficiency over compassion. The moment he noticed Eleanor, he eyed her with skepticism and disdain, muttering under his breath about her age and what he considered her limited usefulness around the ranch. One morning, as Eleanor struggled to lift a heavy crate of tools, Mike approached her, arms crossed and a smirk on his face. "You think this is some kind of hobby farm, lady?" he sneered. "This isn't a place for sightseeing retirees." Eleanor straightened, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. I'm doing my best, Mike. I may be older, but I've worked hard every day since I got here. Mike scoffed, shaking his head. Your best doesn't cut it around here. I don't need people slowing us down, Eleanor. You should just go back to whatever quiet life you had. This place is for people who can keep up. Eleanor felt the sting of his words, but she refused to back down. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin slightly. I'll decide what I'm capable of, Mike. Not you. The foreman's eyes narrowed, clearly annoyed at her defiance. He leaned in, his voice a low, threatening whisper. You'd better watch yourself. The last thing we need around here is someone who thinks they're above the rules. Emily, who had been nearby and overheard the exchange, approached after Mike had walked away, her face full of concern. Eleanor, don't let him get to you. He's just, well, he's like that with everyone. But he especially doesn't like anyone he thinks can't pull their weight. Eleanor sighed, her shoulders heavy. I know he doesn't want me here, Emily, but I need this job. I need the sense of purpose it gives me. I can't just sit at home waiting for life to pass me by. Emily placed a reassuring hand on Eleanor's arm. You don't have to prove anything to him or anyone else. You've already proven to me that you belong here. In the days that followed, Mike continued to belittle Eleanor, making sarcastic remarks and setting her up with the hardest tasks, hoping she'd quit. At times, Eleanor found herself on the brink of giving in. But each time, she remembered why she was there and reminded herself of the determination that had carried her through her life's hardships. She would not let a bitter man like Mike define her worth. One afternoon, as Eleanor was working by herself in the barn, Mike approached her again. I don't know why Mr. Howard hired you, he said coldly. You're just wasting everyone's time. Eleanor paused, looking him directly in the eye. Maybe Mr. Howard sees something you don't, Mike. Maybe he sees that I'm here because I care. This isn't just a job for me, it's a lifeline. The silence between them was thick with tension. For a brief moment, Mike seemed taken aback, as if he hadn't expected such a firm response. But he quickly recovered, his expression hardening once more. We'll see how long that lifeline lasts, he muttered, turning and walking away. As she watched him go, Eleanor felt both anger and an unexpected surge of pride. Despite his harshness, she had stood her ground. She knew she wasn't there to make enemies, but she also wasn't there to be driven away. Eleanor was determined to prove, to herself, if no one else, that she still had strength left to give, and no one, not even Mike, could take that from her. Despite Mike's relentless attempts to undermine her, Eleanor showed up every day, her resilience unshaken. She had faced many challenges in life, and while her body was no longer as strong as it once was, her spirit remained unbreakable. Each morning, she steeled herself, walking onto the ranch with her head held high, determined not to let Mike's scorn drive her away. On a particularly grueling day, Eleanor found herself assigned to clear a large area of tangled brush near the ranch's edge. The work was strenuous, demanding constant bending and pulling, and soon Eleanor felt her muscles strain with every move. As the sun beat down on her, sweat trickled down her forehead, and her hands, though gloved, began to blister. She paused, catching her breath, feeling the ache in her back and shoulders. Just as she was about to push forward, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Mike, watching her with a smug look. Having a little trouble, are we? He taunted, arms folded as he leaned against a nearby post. Maybe it's time to face facts, Eleanor. This work isn't meant for people like you. Eleanor took a deep breath, refusing to let him see her frustration. People like me? She asked, raising an eyebrow. You mean people who don't give up? Who keep pushing even when it's hard? Mike chuckled, clearly unamused by her defiance. No, I mean people who don't belong here. You're just holding us back. Every time you fumble with a simple task, it's more work for the rest of us. Eleanor felt the familiar pang of doubt, his words digging at her insecurities. But she thought of Emily's kindness, of Mr. Howard's trust, and most importantly, of her own need for this sense of purpose. She steadied herself, meeting Mike's gaze with a quiet strength. I may not be as fast or as strong as some of the others, but I give this job everything I have. And that's worth something. Mike's face hardened. Fine, he sneered. Then let's see if you're up for a real challenge. Tomorrow, you'll help with the cattle roundup. That's hard work for anyone, let alone someone. Well, past their prime. Eleanor nodded, accepting the challenge without a word. She knew Mike's intent was to break her, to make her admit defeat. But she was determined to show him, and herself, that she could endure whatever he threw her way. The next day, Eleanor joined the team for the cattle roundup. The work was intense, requiring swift movements and quick decisions as they corralled the cattle. Eleanor's heart raced as she tried to keep up, her breaths coming in quick bursts. She felt the strain on her legs and the burn in her muscles, but she pushed forward, ignoring the pain. She stumbled once, nearly falling, but steadied herself, refusing to give up. Emily was nearby, watching Eleanor with a mix of admiration and concern. During a brief pause, she approached Eleanor. "You're doing great," she said softly, a reassuring hand on Eleanor's arm. "Don't let Mike get to you. He doesn't know what real strength looks like." Eleanor managed a tired smile. "Thank you, Emily. I won't let him push me out. I need this, more than he could ever understand." By the end of the day, Eleanor's body was exhausted, but her spirit felt renewed. She had faced the hardest day yet, proving to herself, and to anyone watching, that she wasn't going anywhere. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt a deep sense of pride, a reminder that dignity and worth weren't measured by age or strength, but by heart and resilience. Though Mike's disapproval still hung over her, Eleanor knew she had earned her place at the ranch. She had fought for her dignity, and that victory was something no one could take from her. The routine at the ranch settled into a familiar rhythm, and Eleanor felt increasingly at home. She had forged a quiet strength, pushing through each day with renewed resilience. But one fateful afternoon, something happened that would shift her path in an unexpected direction. Eleanor had been assigned to clean out the old storage shed near the barn, a dusty, dimly lit building filled with unused equipment and paperwork. As she worked through the clutter, her hands pulling out boxes and files, she came across an open ledger resting on a stack of crates. Out of curiosity, she flipped through it, noticing that the numbers and records seemed odd. Large sums of money were being marked as supplies and maintenance far more often than she had seen during her time there. She frowned, her instincts telling her something wasn't right. Just then, she heard voices approaching. Quickly, Eleanor stepped back, crouching behind a stack of boxes. She recognized one of the voices instantly, Mike. He was talking to someone on his phone, his tone low and conspiratorial. Yeah, he muttered. "I've got everything under control. They trust me here. They don't even check the books. These extra funds? They're as good as ours." Eleanor's heart pounded as she pieced together what was happening. Mike was siphoning money from the ranch, pocketing the profits by falsifying expenses. She felt a mix of shock and anger rise within her. She had known he was unkind and manipulative, but she hadn't expected this level of dishonesty. Her hands clenched into fists as she listened, the full weight of his deceit settling over her. Mike's conversation continued. "Don't worry about Howard. He's too soft to catch on. By the time he figures it out, if he ever does, I'll be long gone." Eleanor's mind raced. She knew that if she confronted him directly, he would likely deny everything, and worse, he could retaliate against her. But she also felt a strong sense of duty to do what was right. The ranch had given her a new purpose, and the thought of Mike exploiting it for his own gain filled her with a fierce resolve. As soon as Mike left, Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands trembling. She examined the ledger again, memorizing the details of the suspicious transactions. She knew she couldn't let this go unreported, but fear clawed at her. What if Mike found out she was the one who exposed him? She remembered his threatening words from before, his sharp, angry eyes. But beneath the fear, she felt a stronger conviction. The ranch, Mr. Howard, and even the young workers like Emily deserved better than to be victims of Mike's schemes. Later that evening, as the ranch grew quiet, Eleanor sat alone in her small apartment, grappling with her dilemma. The easy choice would be to stay silent, to avoid the trouble and protect herself. But she knew she couldn't live with that decision. She remembered her late husband, Frank, who had always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter the risk. Frank, she whispered into the empty room, feeling his presence in her heart. I know you'd tell me to do the right thing. I just hope I'm strong enough. With a steady resolve, Eleanor made her decision. She would go to Mr. Howard and tell him everything. The night before she planned to speak with Mr. Howard, Eleanor lay awake, her mind racing with fears and doubts. What if Mike found out that she was the one who exposed him? He had already shown how ruthless he could be, and she knew that he wouldn't hesitate to retaliate if he suspected her involvement. But as much as she feared the possible consequences, she couldn't ignore the pull of her conscience. Early the next morning, Eleanor prepared herself. She dressed carefully, smoothing her worn shirt and tying her hair back with a resolve that masked her nerves. She knew this was going to be one of the hardest things she had done in years, but the thought of letting Mike's deceit go unchecked was unbearable. She took a steadying breath and made her way to the main office, where Mr. Howard usually spent his mornings. When she arrived, she found Mr. Howard poring over some paperwork, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening into a warm smile. "Eleanor," he greeted, setting his papers aside. "What brings you here this early? Everything all right?" Eleanor took a seat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She took a moment to gather her thoughts before speaking, her voice steady but filled with a quiet determination. "Mr. Howard, there's something I need to tell you. It's about Mike." Mr. Howard's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Go on." She hesitated, feeling the weight of her words. "I've discovered something serious. Yesterday, I overheard a conversation. Mike has been misusing funds, diverting money from the ranch into his own pockets. I found records in the ledger that show inflated expenses for supplies that I know we didn't receive." Mr. Howard's brows knitted together, his expression darkening as he absorbed her words. He leaned forward, his voice low. "Eleanor, do you realize the seriousness of what you're saying?" "Yes, I do," she replied firmly. "And I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe it was true. I know it's risky, but I had to tell you. This ranch means a lot to me, to all of us. You deserve to know the truth." Mr. Howard sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "Thank you, Eleanor. It's not easy to bring forward something like this, especially with someone like Mike involved. I'll handle this carefully, but I want you to know that if this turns out to be true, your courage won't go unnoticed." Eleanor nodded, feeling both relieved and fearful. She had done her part, but a new anxiety crept in. The waiting, the uncertainty of what would come next. Later that day, Mike approached Eleanor with a suspicious glare. "Saw you talking to Howard this morning," he said, his tone laced with accusation. "Got something to share?" Eleanor met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Just a friendly chat, Mike. Nothing you'd be interested in." Mike's eyes narrowed, his voice lowering to a menacing tone. "You'd better keep to yourself, Eleanor. People who stick their noses where they don't belong don't tend to last long around here." Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine, but she refused to let him intimidate her. "I've worked hard for my place here, Mike. I'm not going anywhere." As he walked away, Eleanor took a steadying breath, her heart pounding. She knew she had made a dangerous enemy, but she also knew she had done the right thing. Now, all she could do was trust that Mr. Howard would act on her information and hope that the truth would prevail. The following days were filled with tension as Eleanor waited anxiously for Mr. Howard to take action. She tried to focus on her tasks, but every time she caught sight of Mike, her stomach twisted with fear and anticipation. She noticed him watching her closely, his expression growing darker each time their paths crossed. Still, she held her head high, refusing to let him see her fear. One afternoon, Eleanor was called into the main office. Mr. Howard was seated behind his desk, his face a mixture of anger and determination. Beside him sat another man in a sharp suit. An accountant, Eleanor presumed. Mr. Howard gestured for her to take a seat, and Eleanor's heart raced as she obeyed. "Eleanor, I've looked into what you told me," Mr. Howard began, his voice steady but laced with gravity. "I've had our accountant review the ledgers, and it appears you were right. The discrepancies in the expenses are undeniable, and the evidence points straight to Mike. Eleanor felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the reality of what this revelation meant. "What will happen now?" she asked quietly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Howard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I've arranged for a formal investigation, and Mike has been temporarily suspended while we get to the bottom of this. There's enough evidence already to make it clear that he's been stealing from the ranch." Just then, the door opened and Mike stormed in, his face flushed with anger. He shot Eleanor a venomous look before turning his rage on Mr. Howard. "What's the meaning of this? You're suspending me based on the word of some old woman?" Mr. Howard's gaze was steely, unyielding. "This old woman, as you so rudely put it, brought forward evidence. Evidence that you've been embezzling funds from the ranch." Mike's face twisted with fury, and he pointed an accusing finger at Eleanor. "She's lying. She's had it out for me since day one. This is some scheme she's cooked up to get rid of me." Eleanor met his glare with quiet defiance. "I've done nothing but work hard here, Mike. I told the truth because it was the right thing to do. If you're innocent, you shouldn't have anything to fear from an investigation." Mike scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't belong here, Eleanor. You're just a liability, and sooner or later, everyone will see that." Mr. Howard stood, his voice commanding. "That's enough, Mike. You'll be escorted off the property while the investigation proceeds. If you're innocent, the truth will come out. But if not, I'm prepared to take legal action." Two ranch hands stepped forward, ready to lead Mike out. He cast one last, seething glance at Eleanor before allowing himself to be escorted out, muttering curses under his breath. Eleanor felt a mix of emotions: fear, relief, and a profound sense of justice. She knew she had done the right thing, but the danger wasn't completely over. After Mike was gone, Mr. Howard turned to her with a look of gratitude. "Eleanor, you may have saved this ranch from a serious betrayal. It takes real courage to stand up to someone like Mike, and I won't forget what you did." Eleanor nodded, feeling a swell of pride mixed with relief. "I just couldn't stand by and watch him hurt this place," she replied softly. "This ranch, it's given me a second chance. I had to protect it." Mr. Howard smiled warmly. "You've done more than protect it. You've helped preserve the integrity of this place. You'll always have a place here, Eleanor, and if there's anything you need, you just let me know." As Eleanor left the office, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The ordeal had tested her resilience in ways she hadn't expected, but in standing up to Mike, she had reclaimed her sense of self-worth and dignity. The ranch had become more than a place of work for her. It was now a home, filled with people she cared for deeply. And as she looked out over the sprawling fields, she knew she had found a new purpose here, one worth fighting for. After the investigation concluded, Mike's embezzlement scheme was confirmed, and he was swiftly dismissed from the ranch. The news spread quickly among the workers, and Eleanor noticed the way people began to look at her differently. Whispers of admiration followed her as she went about her work, and even the younger ranch hands started to treat her with newfound respect. She had proven her strength not just physically, but morally, and the entire ranch felt the impact of her bravery. One afternoon, Mr. Howard approached her as she was tending to the horses. His face was thoughtful, as though he had been planning this conversation for some time. "Eleanor," he began, smiling warmly, "I wanted to speak with you about something important." Eleanor straightened, wiping her hands on her work pants. "Of course, Mr. Howard. Is everything all right?" He nodded. "More than all right. Since you joined us, you've shown dedication, integrity, and resilience that's hard to come by. It's clear that you care about this place, about the people here. That's why I'd like to offer you a new role, one that I think you're uniquely qualified for." She blinked, taken aback. "A new role?" "Yes," he said, nodding. "I'd like you to oversee worker welfare and operations support. You'd be the bridge between the ranch hands and management, ensuring that everyone has what they need to succeed here, and that their concerns are heard." Eleanor felt a swell of emotion. She had come to the ranch seeking purpose, and now she was being given a chance to make a real difference, to protect and support the very people who had become her new family. Mr. Howard, I don't know what to say. Thank you. I'd be honored. Mr. Howard smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder. You've earned it, Eleanor. This ranch is better because of you, and I think you're just the person to keep it moving in the right direction. In her new role, Eleanor flourished. She spent her days checking in with the ranch hands, listening to their concerns, and offering advice. She advocated for better resources, safer conditions, and fair schedules. Her experience and empathy quickly won over even the most skeptical of workers. With her insight, the ranch became a place where workers felt truly valued. One evening, as she was closing up, Emily found her and gave her a warm hug. "I'm so proud of you, Eleanor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've made this place a home for all of us." Eleanor returned the hug, her heart full. She had finally found a place where she was needed, respected, and loved. The ranch had become her sanctuary, and she was proud to protect it. As Eleanor settled into her new role at the ranch, word of her actions eventually reached her children, Michael and Sarah. At first, they were surprised, shocked, even, to hear about the life she had built for herself, far from the quiet existence they had imagined. They had left her in a small, unfamiliar town, assuming she would quietly adapt to her new circumstances. But Eleanor had done much more than adapt. She had flourished, and her story of resilience and courage moved them in ways they hadn't anticipated. One weekend, Eleanor received an unexpected call from Michael. His voice was hesitant, softer than she remembered. "Mom, Sarah and I were hoping to come visit. There's a lot we need to talk about." Eleanor's heart raced, a mixture of excitement and apprehension swelling within her. She had spent so much time rebuilding her life that she hadn't dared hope for a real reconciliation with her children. "Of course, Michael. I'd love to see you both." A few days later, Michael and Sarah arrived at the ranch. They looked around in awe at the vast fields, the grazing cattle, and the workers who greeted Eleanor with smiles and respect. It was clear that they hadn't expected to find their mother thriving in such a physically demanding environment, and the pride in the workers' faces as they spoke to her only deepened their surprise. After a brief tour of the ranch, Eleanor led them to a quiet spot overlooking the fields. They sat together, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Sarah broke the silence, her voice thick with emotion. "Mom, I'm sorry," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "We were wrong to push you away. I can see now how much you still have to give, how strong you really are." Michael nodded, guilt evident in his expression. "We thought we were doing what was best, but we were just trying to make things easier on ourselves. We never thought about what you wanted or needed." Eleanor reached out, placing a hand on each of theirs. "I know you both meant well, and, truthfully, this place has given me more than I could have imagined. It wasn't easy, but it's helped me find strength I didn't know I had." They sat together, sharing memories of Frank, their late father, and talking about the life Eleanor had built. She spoke of Emily, Mr. Howard, and the workers who had become her new family. As she spoke, Michael and Sarah listened intently, realizing for the first time how much they had underestimated their mother's resilience and resolve. Before they left, Michael looked at Eleanor, a renewed respect shining in his eyes. "Mom, we'd like to be part of your life again, if you'll let us. We want to support you, to be there for you like we should have been from the start." Eleanor smiled, her heart full of forgiveness and love. "I'd like that, Michael. Let's not dwell on the past. Let's move forward, together." As they hugged, Eleanor felt the weight of the past begin to lift. She had come to the ranch alone, uncertain and grieving, but had found a community, a purpose, and a newfound respect from her family. She knew now that no matter what life threw at her, she would face it with the strength she had found within herself and the love she had rekindled with her family. For Eleanor, it was a second chance at life and family. A chance to live not only for herself but surrounded by the love and respect she had always deserved. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.